All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to have you all. We are admitting people in now, about 94 people in the waiting room, which is exciting. So, yes, welcome to the first of 8 sessions, World Water Week 2026. We're very excited to see you joining. Please introduce yourself using the chat. Share with us where you're joining from, just so we have a feel of who's in the room today. You can just put your name and where you're joining us in the chat. Would love to have a feel of who is in the room today. Welcome, everyone. I'll keep my eyes on the chat just to see who is joining us and from where. Great, welcome. I see people joining from Amsterdam, South Africa, Yemen, Vietnam, Cameroon, Belgium, Romania. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. So, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Before we go any further, I want to mention that you can choose any of the three languages that we have, which you'll see on the next slide. Yes. So it's pretty simple. If you look all the way down, you see the interpretation box. And from there, you can click on that globe icon and choose any of the languages. We have Spanish, we have Arabic, and thanks to Interprefy for making it possible for us to interpret the session live in these two other languages. You can also rename yourselves with your preferred language right in front of your name, so it's easier for people to connect with you, but also in the breakout rooms, so that it's easier for you to engage with other people. And just before we begin, a few house rules. We're still letting in a few more people. A few other house rules that I want to mention. You should be muted on joining and except you need to speak. For example, during the breakout rooms, I would ask that you stay muted. And you can turn on your cameras if you can, if you're in a place where you can. It's nicer to see smiling faces, so why not? And as you do that, I want to mention that this session is recorded. So it's good for you to know that we're recording this session as well as the 8 other sessions that will be coming up, or the 7 other sessions that will be coming up after this. I see something popping up, but I'm not sure what to do. So this session will be recorded and the recording will be shared on YouTube also. As you can see, we have recordings from last year and all the recordings in the 3 languages will be made available on YouTube. And with quite a number of people in the room, time is of essence. I want to say at this point, welcome officially to Water in Communications 2026. And this is the opening session. My name is Sheifumi Adebote and I'm your host. Very excited to do this. I see some known faces, some known names from the previous years, and I say welcome. And to those of you joining us for the first time, I want to say welcome. Water in Communications is in the 6th year, and we continue to provide journalists, water communicators, conveners of water events across the world with practical tools to help them share, people-centered stories to improve public understanding, to counter misinformation, but most of all, I would say to inspire collective responsibility. And that's the theme for this year, Water in Communications. It's communicating water for collective action. We have about 1,200 people that signed up for this year, very exciting. And I will say that it's from across 6 different continents. So one thing is very clear that you, by joining this, are also a part of a global community of communicators, storytellers, and we hope that being part of this community will help you. That said, before we begin, I will invite Virginia Lewis, Newton Lewis, from the Grundfos Foundation to give us some few remarks. That's because the Water in Communication series is organized by the Stockholm International Water Institute, but it's made possible thanks to the support we receive from Grundfos Foundation. So the floor is yours, Virginia, if you're there.
Oh, thank you ever so much. And good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's an absolute pleasure to open this year's Water in Communications programme. The Grundfos Foundation for several years now, and it's been really encouraging to see it grow with more participants and more languages and more outreach every year. And that growth really matters because the underlying water and communications challenge is still very much with us. Put simply, the water sector is not short of solutions or knowledge or technology, but what it often lacks is visibility in the places that decisions about water are actually made. Many of the people who shape water outcomes in finance, in urban development, in agriculture, in industry, in data centres, and in the public don't work on water directly, and it isn't always front of mind for them, yet their decisions have enormous impact on water security. If we want to have better water outcomes, we have to get better at positioning water in those wider conversations. And this is fundamentally a visibility and communications challenge. We need clear, credible, well-targeted communications that connects water to a broader economic, social, and political set of priorities. And the Water and Communications programme is helping build that capacity, and that is why we are so delighted to support it. So thank you ever so much for being here, for joining in, for learning, or for sharing your knowledge, and good luck with the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virgin. I see the applause coming in. Am I still audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I see the applause coming in from left, right, center. You made some very important point there, and I think that's part of, or that's mainly what Water and Communication seeks to achieve. And this is also connected with the World Water Week, which some of you know about, but for those of you who are not aware, or if it's your first time hearing about the World Water Week, then it's a very good time to introduce and mention that the World Water Week for this year will take place in Stockholm. I think it's the 36th edition from the 23rd to the 27th of August. And if you want to sign up, this is the link. You could also scan the QR code if you need to get more information about World Water Week. We'll also put it in the chat so that it's easier for you to find as we move along. And with that said, I think we can move to today's session. But before that, if you're wondering who we are, my name is Fumi Adebote. Like I said earlier, I'll be your host. And I have my co-pilot, Jesse, the Program Officer, World Water Week, joining me today. Subsequently, we'll be joined by Gu Dos Santos also, who will be ensuring that we keep an eye on the chat, or we make sure that everything goes on smoothly. Again, just another reminder before we go on. We have interpretations going on live, so please feel free to use the interpretation function in Arabic, in Spanish, so you can follow the sessions pretty well. For those of you that have checked the World Water Week website before now, you should have seen the program overview for the Water and Communications workshop, but we'll do a very quick recap before we go on. This is what the next couple of weeks will look like. First, if we can change the slide, yes. So it's going to be the same link for all the 8 sessions. I recommend that you put it in your calendar so it's easy for you to go in. The sessions will be recorded, and there are going to be 2 workshop sessions on the 16th and 25th of June. Same time, same link, so it makes it easier for you to be a part of. And for those who are able to attend up to 75%, certificates will be issued to you at the end of the program. So today we set the foundation, and from there we move sort of gradually into the rest of the program. Just for the sake of time, I will just run through this. Week 1 is about the foundation. Week 2 is where we delve into policy and influence. Week 3, we move to people and power, and then week 4 will be equity, but also action, getting your hands to move and do the work after all of the training. So feel free to explore, and feel free, just come ready to learn. If you're ready, we are ready. And like I said, in setting the foundation for everything that we follow, we are looking at the title of today's session is Telling the Water Story, How Communication Drives Action. Telling the water story, how communication drives action. And this is important because 2026 is a convergence moment for water, as you will learn in subsequent session. But we also want to understand the power of communication in turning this moment into collective action. And our speakers today bring very unique lenses and perspective into the conversation today. We're very excited to have Alice Nassar Jaraiseh from SIWI, the Stockholm International Water Institute. Welcome, Alice. Just a little bit about Alice. She is an hydrologist with extensive experience in program management, project management, capacity building, and water governance. And as the program manager at Stockholm International Water Institute, she leads knowledge management efforts, supporting applied research, advisory services, and training. Next to Alice, we also have Catherine. Catherine Early is a freelance environmental journalist and editor. She specializes in environment and sustainability for more than 20 years, and she writes for Ethical Reports, Dialogue Earth, and the Ends Report, among others. Lastly, we have my friend and brother, Kundai, Associate Professor of Rhetorics and Media Studies at the Lewis and Clark College. His research engages around rhetorical studies, environmental communication, and Black studies. And he's also a board member of the International Environmental Communications Association. With that said, I think it's about time for us to get into the meat of today's session. But just to prepare you, we'll have Alice speaking first for about 15 minutes, followed by Catherine, Kundai, and then we'll break into breakout rooms where you get to interact directly with them, ask them questions, and they can help further, sort of in an up-close way, pass along their messages. With that, Alice, I would love to pass the word to you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining this session. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I guess the reason I am here is indeed to share with you the perspective that we have at the Stockholm International Water Institute on water in communication. I will refer to the Institute as SIWI, and I do hope that this will not distort the translation. So when I say SIWI, I'm referring to the Stockholm International Water Institute. And if you are familiar with SIWI and the work that we do, you would know that we focus usually on the interfaces between different actors, perhaps I should say, within the water sector. So it's about bridging policy and science with people as well. So I will focus the presentation I have today on water as a connector. And I wanted to start with telling a story, a memory I have from the beginning of my professional career when I was asked to accompany a team who was preparing for a study guide on water for the Swedish study association called Census, which focuses on public education. So it's basically for anyone who is interested in joining a study circle, as we call it in Sweden, and learning more about a certain topic. And this was going to be about water, with the entry point of the Abrahamic religions. And at that time, I was working in Palestine, and the project team, they came then to Palestine and Israel and Jordan as well to film then from the region and around the river Jordan. And what I wanted to share with you is how clearly I was affected by the testimonies that they gathered from all people they met across the different ethnic groups, but also across the different actors, if I may say, like when we say, like if they met people from policy, from academia, from from like farmers and water practitioners, and whoever they spoke to when they asked this simple question, like, what is water to you? The vast majority was saying water is life. And I guess this is something that I carry with me yet today, because water is life. And we all depend on water every single day. So in this sense, water is deeply human, linking people and progress, as the theme is for this year's World Water Week. There are for sure the technical issues, and that I know of as a hydrogeologist. We have the water metrics, we have the infrastructure, we have all these discussions about the governance, who gets what water, who is it available for who, is it accessible to who, and so on. But I mean, also, I mean, as a hydrologist, I'm very familiar with the hydrological cycle and how water then is connecting land, ocean, and atmosphere. But then also water is connecting us as people as well. Water is connecting communities that share the same water resource, for instance. What is also connecting the different sectors, especially like when we speak of food systems, for instance, agriculture, and how I mean, 70% of the water that we use is actually used within agriculture. We have the hydropower, for instance, water for energy, the healthcare, the livelihoods. So across all these sectors, we have water there as a very specific, I should say, connector between these. But I guess if we are to relate this to communications, and the challenge is indeed when we speak of water, they don't really, if we think of people, how they experience water, it's not a sector to them. I mean, in the end, it is about the water they get, the water that they use. If you are, you know, if you are a household, the head of the household, it's about the water bill that you will be paying by the end of the month. If you're a farmer, it's about the crops and whether you have enough water for irrigation. If you are experiencing the climate challenges that are there with more water and flooding or less water and water scarcity, or even like in relation to healthcare, when you don't have clean water to support you and the health risks that this is creating as well. So how does this relate to the communication then? And I guess this is where I feel that we are always there, not trying to simplify what water is about, but trying to make it more concrete. We're trying to tell a story, like Shay said, about water for people, like connecting the climate impact, for instance, to the daily life, showing how water, different things related to the water, different decisions could affect food, for instance, agriculture or energy or even health as well. Like just making these complex systems, perhaps I should say, something that you can relate to and understand in a way. I don't know if you're familiar with the Guardian's YouTube channel. It's complicated, but there they have these short videos presenting different topics that I guess maybe are complicated, but trying to make them understandable and relatable in a way. And I like that very much because it's very seldom about a topic as a standalone thing. It's always acting within a much broader and bigger reality. And the same applies to water. It's not a standalone issue, but it is actually it's actually sitting at the center of very many of the global challenges, even related to climate, for instance. And I guess in this sense, this year in particular, 2026, is not just any other year. It's also like a very important year for water, since we mentioned already the World Water Week taking place in August, but we also have the UN FCCC Conference of the Parties, the 31st one taking place in Istanbul this year in November, where we as SIWI are also trying to bring together the water community in Water for Climate Pavilion to also bring people together again to talk about water from their perspectives and explaining it perhaps to each other and to other people as well in a way that makes it relatable, that makes it a little bit easier perhaps to understand. We also, of course, have the UN Water Conference happening later this year in December in Abu Dhabi. And I guess the importance of these events are that it will be possible to build a narrative and to use these events as milestones towards, a bigger splash about the water story. So I guess there is a risk related to fragmented messaging or perhaps competing narratives or maybe even missed opportunities for the momentum. But there are also opportunities for communication where we can reinforce consistent messages about water's central role as a connector and to create this sense of urgency and collective action when we together can shape and phrase the messaging, and also bringing the stories from the communities, the local stories, to the global platforms, basically. And I guess at SIWI, we do believe that this is exactly the kind of moment where communications can bridge science and policy and connect global discussions with community voices and ensure inclusivity is not only an afterthought, but that it is something that we live and act upon in our daily work as well. So I would say that 2026 does give us a rare window to align the narratives, mobilize attention, and elevate water as a shared global priority. I think, this was a little bit quicker than I had prepared it. So.
That is absolutely fine.
Yeah.
That is absolutely fine. And I think it helps us to spend a little more time also with Catherine. But I think you've done an excellent job in framing water as a connector, in stating where we are right now, and also how we need to move from here. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank
I
you.
see the love, I see the applause in
Thank you very much.
in the emojis. So that's really, really great. Thank you so much, Alice. So I think your presentation answered two of the big questions we're hoping to answer here. And one of it is, why does 2026 matter? why is water moving to the center of the conversations, whether climate, development, or governance conversations? And I think you did that in a very apt way. Second thing that I saw from your presentation was that you've helped us to frame or to understand water as a system connector, how it connects from climate to food to energy to equity. And this is where we now move to the second part. What are the gaps that are still in the current water narratives that we have today? And at this point, I would love to welcome Catherine. Catherine introduced earlier, and from our presentation, she's going to help us understand the link between evidence, accountability, and public narrative. So, Catherine, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Catherine Early. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm speaking to you from the UK, where it's actually been very wet for the past few hours. You may think that it's always wet here, like we have that reputation, but it's actually become, the last few years, we've had a lot of very long dry spells in the spring and summer. We've just had a very unusual heat wave here, where it's been 35 degrees in quite a few places around England, and yeah, so that's been in the news a lot. But yes, people think it rains all the time in the UK, but that actually isn't true anymore. So that's water myth number one, busted for you there. Yeah, I've been specialising in environmental issues for the whole of my journalism career, which is more than 20 years now, both as a staff journalist and as a freelancer for about the last 8 or 9 years. And I've written about water in many different contexts, so water quality and pollution, quantities of water, either too much with flooding or too little with drought, access to water, water security, and also water and sanitation. And my articles cover the social aspects of this in terms of human rights, human health, impact on livelihoods, but also environmental in terms of ecosystems, plants and wildlife, and so on. So yeah, and also I write for quite a few different publications as a freelancer, so a lot of them are kind of specialist or trade press, where the readers are working in a role related to sustainability, law or policy, or in a campaign group, but also write for public-facing websites such as The Ecologist, and actually a weather forecasting website where I write climate and nature kind of news for them. So yeah, the mainstream media interest in water issues in the UK is very much comes and goes, which has always seemed odd to me, considering, as Alice said, water is life. So, you know, why is it we only have a very fleeting interest in this? Coverage here by the media, the mainstream media, is sort of largely reactive, so it depends on specific events or declarations of official crisis, or sort of campaign reactions to that. So there's a lot of coverage during those events. Like last year, there was a drought in the UK. It started very early on in the year. It was very visible, you know, yellow grass and dried up rivers and reservoirs and so on. So there was a lot of coverage from, you know, the impact on households, hose pipe bans, as we call them in the UK, where there's water restrictions are announced by water companies, impacts on farmers and crops and so on. And then a similar sort of pattern for floods. You get the flooded households, business and transport impacts and so on. But in between those kind of events, the media interest tends to be pretty low. Yeah, so for example, last year was kind of interesting because we had this drought in the summer, which was very obvious, and lots of stories, but actually it continued for most of the winter. We were technically still in drought, and water companies were talking about bringing in new hosepipe bans in spring or summer unless we had above average rainfall. But that didn't really get any kind of pick up because at the same time it was actually a very wet winter. So it was raining and pouring every single day. So it's a bit hard to land a story with an editor when there's that kind of contradiction going on. That's quite a tricky communications angle, I think, with water, because these events build up over a long time, but they don't necessarily have a kind of hook that the mainstream media want to cover. So they don't want to really write about drought in December when people are looking out the window and it's raining every day. That's just not really something they go for. Yeah, so there doesn't tend to be a lot of coverage of causes behind particular water issues. The flooding the conditions that lead to a flood can build up over time. Maybe it's in an urban area, it's front gardens being paved over, or in rural areas, there's some kind of ecosystem degradation, which means that the water is flowing down off hills more quickly if trees have been cut down, or peatland is degraded, and so on. There's not a lot of coverage of that in mainstream media. So yeah, but it sort of, so I think there's a sort of large scale lack of public awareness of how these events build up and how they could be prevented. We could be more adapted to these, but because the media treats it as if it happened overnight, like it rained a lot, therefore there's a flood because the river burst its bank. That's how it tends to be portrayed, and so I think there's a lack of understanding by the public of what leads to these events, because it's never really explained. So yeah, anyway, I'm going to talk about a sort of specific story, or a sort of package of stories really that kind of came together in the UK in the past few years, where water stories have started to really land, and this has led to something that was a very specialist kind of niche issue in terms of coverage that it got, and then now it broke out and became an election issue, and something that most people know about, and it's still going on. So yeah, this is the UK sewage scandal, and I'll just explain what's happened here, because it just sounds incredible that in England in 2026, water companies have been pumping raw sewage into the rivers and the seas, and this has been going on for a really long time. And another shocking thing about this is that much of this pumping into the rivers was legal. Water companies are allowed to do this. However, it's supposed to be only in exceptional circumstances. So when heavy rain would otherwise cause sewage to back up into people's homes, they're allowed to use that as a kind of emergency measure. But however, it's turned out the water companies have actually been abusing this and use it as an excuse to cover up the fact that they have not maintained infrastructure at pumping plants. So they were just pumping it into the river and hoping the problem would go away. And this was basically to increase profits for their shareholders. Now, as a story, the data behind this has been around for many years in regulatory reports. So if you looked hard enough, it was there, but it just didn't really get any coverage other than in some specialist publications. And it's taken quite a long time for the mainstream media to catch up. So the issue's been largely invisible to the public at large until quite recently. The scale of the pollution was really massive. Just between 2019 and 2024, water companies in England discharged sewage for a total of 16.3 million hours. So just imagine this pipe going into a river, your local river, people's local rivers all over the country, and literally raw sewage pouring out of that into the river. It's really pretty incredible. And the numbers have actually, they fluctuate different years have different amounts because it does depend a bit on the weather. 2022 it was 1.7 million hours of pumping. 2024 3.6 million hours. So yeah, it goes up and down a bit, but overall it's horrific. Yeah, so also there's other kind of stories feeding into this. A lot of wildlife campaigners, environmental campaigners have raised the issue of the ecological health of rivers. We don't under the EU Water Framework Directive, which many rivers are classified under. There's not a single river in England that's rated as being in good ecological health, which means that all aspects of the river are functioning well and supporting ecosystems and so on. So yeah, and also a financial story going alongside this is that water companies in England were privatised in 1989 with no debt. And since then, they have paid out a total of 78 billion in dividends over the 32 years to 2021, whilst collectively accumulating over 64 billion in debt. And then, instead of using the money they were earning to pay for the upkeep of their water infrastructure, they've been paying out to shareholders and passing on the cost of the debt to their customers through higher water bills. There's actually been quite a big jump this year. So, I mean, this is a really not a good look with the cost of living crisis. So this is another thing that's really angered a lot of people, and it's triggered a lot of media from a whole different angle. It means that this story could be covered from, the financial pages and the city and so on, and the consumer press. There's a cost of living crisis going on, as I'm sure there is in many of your countries, and having water companies go up that much when people know that water companies have been causing all this pollution and just profiting their shareholders, it's really not a good look. So all of this has kind of come together. Yeah, I think the worst one has been Thames Water, which is the UK's largest water company, supplying 15 million people, and that's been facing potential insolvency. So that's that's a story that's had a lot of coverage. So there's all these different things going on that have been building up for years, but I think often with these stories, the thing that kind of tips it into mainstream media coverage is, there's often one thing that tips it over, and I think COVID was a major factor, because there was obviously people couldn't go to their local swimming pool anymore because of lockdown. So a lot of people were going to their local rivers and swimming there. And that brought huge numbers of people into contact with their local river for the first time. And then they saw the pollution and they heard about it. People saying, "Oh no, you shouldn't actually swim in that river because this is what's happening. You might get sick." So then a lot of campaigning by groups such as, we have one called Surfers Against Sewage, talking about the amount of sewage going into the rivers, because obviously that ends up in the sea where they're surfing, and all the wildlife conservation groups. A lot of local community groups have sprung up because people would see the state of the pollution, and they started campaigning. A lot of these people who've never done any kind of campaigning before, so that was interesting. There's been a few other ones, one called Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. So all of these groups have raised awareness and put out a lot of reports about with data and so on. So yeah, I think that was a major thing that's turned it into a big story, and yeah, it's this ongoing. It's led to government reforms, which are, people are saying are not good enough, but that's still in train, and also TV docudrama series recently. So yeah, I think all of that has added together to make something that was basically a specialist, only being covered in the specialist media, and it's sort of about regulation and policy, and a bit kind of seen as a bit boring, and turned it into a mainstream story that's been covered in multiple different angles, and is leading to real impacts.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. I was trying to give you the sign to wrap up, and of course, there'll still be a lot more time to engage further when we get into the breakout room. But before we get into the breakout room, very quickly, I want us to also hear a little bit from Kundai. You shared, I do agree and can relate to some of the things you say. Sometimes it appears like, oh, we didn't know this was happening, but it's been there all along, right? And it depends on how we write and, what stories are being told for people to say, hey, I read this thing 5 weeks ago, I read this thing 2 years ago. And this is why I want to welcome Kundai Chirindo to share with us why some stories stick and how to write one. A little bit practical here for the next 15 minutes, and then we go into the breakout rooms. Kundai, please. The floor is yours, Kundai. You can pull up your screen also.
All right, I had just lost my my mouse here. Good morning, people. If you're out here on the United States West Coast, as I am, it's just approaching 6 o'clock in the morning. Good afternoon to my friends across the way, and of course, good evening everywhere else you might be. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen in just a little bit, but before I got started, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am coming and speaking to you from the lands that were under the original trusteeship of many tribal people in this area, including the Multnomah, the Cathlamet, the Clackamas, the Tumwater, the Watalala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and of course many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River catchment valley up here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. It's of course important to start these deliberations that we talk about natural resources by acknowledging the ancestors of place, and to recognize that we who are here because of the sacrifices that were often forced on them. And in remembering those communities, we honor their legacies and their lives, as well as their descendants, their leaders, past, present, and rising. It's through resources like this very one, and many other offerings that will be coming in this space, that we have opportunities to resist and to build beyond the many problems that we're talking about, including problems of coloniality, problems of sexism, and other forms of oppression that have and continue to dominate the world that we live in. That said, I'm going to get into my presentation. As Seifunmi was just saying, I am, can you see my shared screen yet?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
I think it's coming up now.
All right. All right. As Seifumi said, I am an associate professor of rhetoric and media studies, which is what my institution calls communication studies. I've been at Lewis and Clark College for now about 14 years. All of my degrees are in communication studies. And I tend to write and do research around two specific areas, interested mostly in questions of what we call in the discipline environmental communication or environmental rhetorics in particular. And I'm also interested in discourses of space and place, how we perform and define and restory and contest places. So these two areas of my research are interconnected. I could not be more happier to be joining you this morning where I am, because for years, those of us who study communication have always felt that communication was central to the work that we try and do in so many of these spaces around environmental, climatic, spatial, natural resource management and restoration. And so it's thrilling to find like-minded people who value communication, who are trying to think about these problems from a communication perspective. In fact, a colleague and I, Phaedra Pizzulo at the University of Colorado Boulder, are working on a book that's going to be titled Environmental Communication, the Basics, for practitioners, for people in the field like us to think about how we might leverage what we know about communication, which we know about a lot because at least in the Western academy, we have been studying and thinking about, in particular, rhetoric, social influence, communication from the very beginning. At Plato's school, Plato's Academy, back in ancient Greece, they taught 3 subjects, and rhetoric was one of those subjects that we've been thinking about for a very, very long time. I want to spend the rest of my time really thinking with you about what is it that defines what I'm going to talk about as a rhetorical story. What is it that makes a story compelling? What makes a story stick? And the way I want to do that is by retelling you a story. And then we're going to think about that story in terms of what makes it rhetorical, what makes it compelling, what makes it work. I'm going to give you 3 markers or 3 attributes of rhetorical narratives, or 3 things that signify that this is a story that's being told with the express purpose, not just of entertainment, not just of thrilling people and holding their attention for a while, but to move people, to try and goad people into action. And then I'll stop there and we'll go into breakout rooms. One of the very first people I wrote about in terms of environmental communication was my heroine, Wangari Maathai, who, of course, as we all know, won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for her work on the environment. I'm going to excerpt a story that she writes about in her own passage, which I think is one of the really cool water stories that has impacted my own thinking and work of the last few years. In Unbowed, she writes, "When I was a child, I loved listening to the birds around our homestead, and learning their names. Collecting firewood for the household was a frequent activity, and I would often help my mother do it. The country was dotted with hundreds of huge migumo or wild fig trees, their bark color of elephant skin, and thick gnarled branches with roots springing out and anchoring the tree to the ground. Fig trees had great green canopies beneath which grew dense undergrowth. This tree's canopy was probably 60 feet in diameter, and it produced numerous fruits that birds loved. When the fruit was ready, you could find hundreds of birds feeding on them. The undergrowth of the fig tree was also very fertile because people did not cut anything near those trees, but allowed the undergrowth to flourish, and all this added to the tree's mystery. About 200 yards from the fig tree that was in my backyard, there was a stream named Kanungu, with water so clean and fresh that we drank it straight from the stream. As a child, I used to visit the point where the water bubbled up from the belly of the earth to form a stream. I imagine that very few people have been lucky enough to see the source of a river. At the point where the stream came out of the ground, were planted arrowroots, and along the stream were banana plants and sugarcane, which were typical food crops. Arrowroots, when cooked, provide a starchy tuber like potatoes and grow only where there's a lot of water. At the same time, they were planted all along the banks of small, slow-flowing streams. Their large, deep, arcing leaves provide a hideaway big enough for a small child such as me to sit underneath. And when it rained, The silver drops of water would dance on the broad fronds above me and cascade to the ground. We also used these leaves to fetch water from the river and drink it. The water looked clean and fresh against the sparkling green leaves. Underneath the arrowroots, there would be thousands of frog eggs. They were black, brown, and white beads that I would try to make a beautiful necklace. I would spend hours trying to pick them up, as gently as I could, hoping that I could put them around my neck. However, each time I placed my hands below to lift them, the jelly that held them together would break apart, and they would slip through my fingers back into the stream, and I would be so disappointed. Time and again, I would return to that stream to play with the frogs' eggs. I'll stop there. If you haven't read Unbowed, it's a really moving personal narrative of how this young lady becomes an ecologist and a scientist and one of the world's greatest advocates of water and of the natural resources. But I want to think with you about this story, this excerpt that I just read, and wonder with you, what makes a story rhetorical? What is a rhetorical narrative? What are these kinds of stories that stick? We all know what stories are. We tend to think about stories as comprising of some kind of plot, some kind of scene that's set somewhere in a particular location. We call that the scene. Stories tend to have some central agon, some central fight. And of course, stories have a point that they try and drive home. Some stories have points that are entirely internal to themselves. Some stories have points that tell us something about the world. I'm interested here, and I think we ought to be interested in stories that have what I think about as rhetorical themes. Themes, the point of which is to argue something, to make a point to someone. The excerpt I just read to you from Wangari Maathai does that. She tells us, she convinces us, she tells us in a compelling way that water is what you all have been talking about this morning as life. Water is the great integrator, is the thing that joins together the plants that she grew up hiding under, the frog eggs that she would try and pick up and adorn herself with a necklace. Water was the thing that provided the firewood that her family lived with, used for sustenance. Water was the central connector of everything. That's the point of the story. Implied in that is an inherent concern for doing something to protect it, for doing something to keep to keep that resource available. I ended the excerpt by reading her talking about how she used to come back over and over and over again to that stream. And that's the challenge for us, to protect these resources so that we not only can do that as ourselves, right, but for also generations that are coming after us. This brings me then to the second quality of stories that are compelling stories that stick. And it's the idea of narrative probability. For quite some years now, we have known, since the mid-'80s, so almost 42 years now, we've known that people tend to be moved, people tend to respond to stories that have a quality of what's known as narrative probability, a quality of coherence, a quality of consistency. The stories that we tell ought to hang together. The stories that we tell ought to have an internal consistency to them, right? If a story does not hang together, people are not likely going to buy into it. A third quality of a story that I want to talk about is the quality of fidelity. By fidelity, I mean the notion that, I got behind on my slides here, the notion that a story rings true for its listeners. It's got to sound like something that happens in your life, something that relates to your locale that you're in. It's fascinating to hear Catherine talk about talk about water troubles in the UK. And of course, it sounds real because she's talking about famous rivers that we've all heard about and that we're all familiar about. And I, of course, am familiar with the history of plumbing and waterworks in the UK that they used to just drain right into the water, into the waterways, into the river for a long time. So that echoes for me, and that resonates, and it sounds true. So one of the things we want to make sure that we're doing is we try and restory water to make it topical again, to make it a sticky topic for folks, is to make sure that we're trying to imbue the stories that we tell with this quality of fidelity, this quality of the stories ringing true for people. Okay, so in the breakout room, the one I'll be in, I'm going to do more of this sort of thinking with you all about how do we make stories stick? What are these qualities of probability? What are these qualities of fidelity? And how do we identify the point or the moral of a story that points towards rhetorical or persuasive ends which seek to extend influence to others? I'm going to stop there for now, and thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you so much, Kundai. Really appreciate that. I see people smiling. I see the applause popping up. And really, what powerful ideas you've shared. I was wondering if you could share maybe a link to that detail. It could be useful to share with the group after the session today. Thanks. Thumbs up. And now we've heard, very strong arguments, if I could put it that way. And at this point, we're going to break into rooms. I know you still want to hear more from Catherine, from Alice, from Kundai, and we'll do that in the breakout rooms. There are going to be 3 breakout rooms. I'll launch them in a sec. The first one will be focused on translating policy into stories people care about and how to find the human angle in this institutional language. Policies could be a bit complex, but if you feel overwhelmed by it and you're wondering, how can I find, some story angles in it, then you should join breakout room 1 with Alice. The second breakout room is Catherine, and she'll be speaking around holding power to account. This is what she's done with her many articles over the years, 20 years, gosh. And then how can you as a communicator use evidence? She spoke about it when she spoke earlier. How can you find evidence, and how can you use that to get people to act? And the third breakout room, Kundai will sort of keep up delving a little bit more on why some stories stick, how to find that angle, the language, the probability narrative, as it calls it, and how you can use that to build action, to mobilize action and build trust. So the breakout rooms are launched now. Please choose one of the rooms that you find most convenient. And here it's going to be up to you to listen or to speak now. And the facilitators will be listening more to you, sharing some thoughts here and there. But this is where you get to speak. You ask your questions. You ask any specific questions that you want. And we'll be in the breakout room for the next 20-25 minutes, and we'll be back to wrap up. So please choose any of the breakout rooms, and I will be here to help if anyone has any challenge. Jesse and I will be here to help. So let's go. Okay, the breakout room will close in 45 seconds, and I see people are returning here already. I jumped into the different breakout rooms to just follow through, listen to some of what were being discussed, and I think I found them very interesting. And I'm looking forward to also hearing like a little recap from you all about what was discussed in the breakout rooms. And anyone can volunteer for that, just to be clear. Okay, more people coming in. Welcome back from the breakout rooms. How was it? Do you want to respond with emojis? Yes. Or just put in the chat, what were your impressions? Oh, I see. Some of you loved it. Some of you celebrated. Applause. Thumbs up. Great. Welcome back. Welcome back. We'll wait a few more seconds for those that are not here yet to join us. And like I said earlier, I was jumping, sort of cross-carpeting through the rooms, and I was following some of the thoughts and what you were discussing, from semi-fiction stories to fiction stories to some of you sharing, I think it was Sumbo sharing a childhood story about Stein Water where she was growing up. Really incredible, really incredible. So just before we wrap up, again, for those who joined, halfway into, we had 3 breakout rooms. The first was Alice from SIWI, and it was focused on translating policy into stories people care about. The second was catering, and it was around holding power to account, how communicators can use evidence to report out to pressure decision makers. And the third was Kundai, why some stories stick, the framing, the language choices that build trust and action. In a few minutes, let's say 1 or 2 minutes, I want someone from room 1 to volunteer and just do like a quick recap of what was discussed, what stood out for you in that room. And then from Catherine's room 2, and the last volunteer from room 3, which Kundai led. And it could go in any flow. Just unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then in 2 minutes, please. Nope, we don't want to see your whiteboard. Yes, so any volunteers? Otherwise, I'll then turn to our facilitators to just do like a recap. And in this, I will start with the reverse order. So Kundai, if you could in a few minutes, just wrap up. What were the things that stood out in the breakout room, and what should we, leave this room thinking about as we get off our systems and our screens?
Yeah, thanks. We shared stories that were impactful to us, that were stories that was going to get us to think about what it was about those stories that was impactful. I think one of the themes that came through was that these stories are often human stories, that these stories have to do with pains that real people are feeling. We heard about stories that of too much, too little. Too polluted water. We heard stories of water having, leading to outbreaks of disease. Water as a means of discovering how different people live in different areas of the country. And I tried to end this by reminding us to sort of keep our audiences in mind and try to think about telling stories that cultivate, that facilitate, that increase that probability, the sense of the story cohering, and the fidelity, the sense of the story making sense to that audience, whether they be technicians and scientists or lay people out in the backwaters of a country, or whether they be people who are educated and general audience people. We have to keep that in mind.
Super. Thank you so much. Catherine, if we could move swiftly to you. You're muted. Sorry, Catherine.
Sorry, I don't know how I ended up.
There you go.
Meeting. So we had a couple of people who spoke from, they worked in their country, water organizations, and they spoke about how hard it can be to communicate with the public about this topic, because they're generally not very water literate, and it's quite technical. And also somebody asked about how to tell stories about water without creating alarm, because a lot of it's public health related, and then we talked about keeping stories balanced and speaking to scientists, especially with microplastics and PFAS, and what do we know about the actual health impacts, and what do we not know, and what people could do to try and avoid this in their lives, keep it kind of practical. That's about all we have time for.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. And Alice, I was in your room and someone was talking about policy, and so Alice, please, the floor is yours. What's a recap from your session, from your breakout room?
Well, I guess the recap is indeed that when we have the policies, most often they are building on real science, and that's the language we are using in order to get things right. But then when we need to when we need to engage with the communities and when we need to have them included in this, it is important to communicate in a way that they can relate to and that can be inclusive as well, where we also touched upon youth engagement and collective action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you so much, Kundai, for sharing, but also for facilitating this session. And like I said, I think the conversations were quite useful. I really enjoyed jumping in and out and listening and seeing people engage. And I do hope that at least some of my own biggest takeaways that yes, we now understand 2026 is not business as usual. It's a year where water is moving to the center of climate, and there is so much responsibility on you as a communicator, as a journalist, on how you report and how you communicate and how that can shape whether these issues are understood, acted upon, or ignored. And I also want to say that, I mean, you've registered for this. It's also important that you continue to leverage the connection, the people we meet here. In the past, there's been WhatsApp group, but you can also connect with each other on LinkedIn. Try to use the chat as much as possible to share your works and relevant links. And we will make sure that we get across those, we sort of collate those relevant links and share it with the audience. Recordings will be made available in a few days, hopefully by the end of this week, so you can listen again in English, in Spanish, and in Arabic. A big thank you again to our speakers, Alice, Catherine, and Kundai, and of course to the Grundfos Foundation. Virginia, thank you. I see Anne is also on the call. Thank you so much for making this possible. Really do appreciate it. And to you, the participants, for giving us this 90 minutes of your time and listening. I hope it's been worth your time, and you are the reason why we do this. We'll meet again in 2 days' time on Thursday. So I just want to say a very big thank you. Before you leave, as you exit the room, there's going to be a feedback survey popping up on your screen. It takes less than 60 seconds to fill it up. Just let us know what worked, what do we need to improve upon, and we're very excited to welcome you again on Thursday. Same time, it will be 14 o'clock on the Stockholm side, CEST. And depending on where you're joining us from, please check your time. And we will be talking about building powerful water narrative, sort of building on the foundation of today. What makes a compelling water story? Please do not miss it. Until then, thank you so much. My name is Sheifumi Adebote. Thank you, Jesse. And stay curious, stay connected, keep learning, and goodbye for now. See you all on Thursday, 14 o'clock CEST time. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks so much.